My name is Georgia. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with the same three words: calm, dependable, quiet. I live just outside of Manchester in the UK. I work as a financial compliance officer for a mid sized firm, the kind of job that requires you to notice details no one else sees and fix problems before they become disasters. It's steady work, invisible work. The kind of work people only appreciate when it stops being done. If you met me at a family gathering, you probably wouldn't remember much about me afterward. I'm not the loudest in the room. I don't interrupt. I don't compete for attention. I listen. I observe. I clean up the glasses when conversations get too heated. I refill plates. I make sure everyone else is comfortable. And that's exactly how my in laws saw me. When I married Daniel, I didn't just marry a man. I married into a family system that had already decided who everyone was. His mother was the matriarch. His older sister was the outspoken one. His younger brother was the golden boy. Daniel was the peacekeeper. And I was a helpful addition, the extra pair of hands, the one who would be so good at organizing things, the one who didn't mind staying behind to wash dishes, the one who would understand. Over time, understanding quietly became an expectation. Expectation became assumption. An assumption became entitlement. This isn't a story about screaming matches or dramatic revenge. No one threw plates. No one was cartoonishly cruel. In fact, that's what made it harder to explain. The disrespect came wrapped in smiles. The dismissal sounded like practicality. The inequality looked like tradition. For years, I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that families are complicated, that keeping the peace mattered more than being seen. But something shifted. The day I realized that while I was being treated like the maid in their home, I had quietly become the only one paying the mortgage on it. What follows isn't about punishment, it's about clarity. It's about what happens when the quiet one in the house finally understands her own leverage and decides to use it without raising her voice. I'm not proud of everything I tolerated, but I am proud of how I chose to respond. Have you ever been underestimated simply because you didn't feel the need to be loud? To Daniel's family, I was the kind of woman you don't worry about. Not because I was incapable, but because I was predictable. When we first started visiting his parents' house every Sunday, I slipped naturally into the background. His mother, Margaret, ran the kitchen like a command center. His sister, Claire, filled the air with commentary. His brother, Oliver, arrived late and left early, usually with leftovers packed neatly by someone else. And me? I cleared plates. At first, I did it out of politeness. I was raised to contribute when entering someone else's home. You don't sit while others work. You don't wait to be asked. You notice and you help. Margaret noticed that I noticed. "Oh, George is such a gem," she would say lightly, passing me another stack of dishes. She doesn't need to be told. It sounded like praise. It felt like approval. So I smiled. But slowly, something subtle shifted. Instead of asking, she began assuming. Instead of thanking, she began directing. "Georgia, could you just... Georgia, since you're already up. Georgia, you're so much better at this than Claire." It was always framed as competence, no obligation. Daniel didn't see it at first. Or perhaps he did. But in his family, this was normal. The women who were good stepped in. The women who were difficult sat down. And I had no interest in being difficult. Outside that house, I managed regulatory audits worth millions of pounds. I reviewed contracts line by line. I identified compliance risks before executives even recognized exposure. My job required precision and authority. Inside that house, I was handed a tea towel. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I convinced myself it didn't matter. Because I loved Daniel. Because families take time. Because harmony has value. When Daniel and I decided to move into the house his parents partially owned, a temporary arrangement, they called it, I thought proximity would build familiarity. Instead, it solidified my role. Margaret still had a key. She came by unannounced. She adjusted things, rearranged cupboards, left notes about better ways to maintain the home. Claire joked openly, "Well, at least we know the house will always be spotless with Georgia here." Everyone laughed, including me. The truth is, I didn't mind doing things. I mind being unseen. There's a difference. I paid attention to tone, to patterns, to whom was expected to contribute, and who was excused. Oliver never washed a dish. Claire never offered. Daniel helped occasionally, but it was framed as generosity, not responsibility. My help was default. Over time, I realized something quietly unsettling. The more competent I proved myself, the smaller I became in their eyes. I wasn't the new daughter-in-law building a life. I was infrastructure, reliable, functional, replaceable. And because I didn't protest, they mistook my silence for agreement. What they didn't understand was that silence doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it means observation. Sometimes it means you're still gathering information. Sometimes it means you haven't decided yet what the truth requires you to do. At that stage, I hadn't decided anything. I was still telling myself it was minor, still believing that effort would eventually translate into respect. But respect that must be earned endlessly is rarely given freely. And I was about to learn that the role they assigned me wasn't accidental. It was convenient for them. The first real cut didn't come with shouting. It came with paperwork. Daniel and I had been living in the house for nearly a year when his father suggested we formalize things properly. The house technically belonged to his parents, but we were covering the monthly payments, or at least that's what everyone believed. The truth was simpler. Daniel's freelance income fluctuated. Mine didn't. So over time, I quietly began covering more. First 50%, then 60, then nearly all of it. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It was practical. I earned more. I preferred stability. I didn't announce it because I didn't think I needed to. Money, in my mind, wasn't leverage. It was a responsibility. One Sunday afternoon, Margaret placed a folder on the dining table while the kettle boiled. "We've had a little chat," she said, glancing at her husband. "It's probably time to adjust the arrangement." I assumed this meant transferring partial ownership to Daniel and me, perhaps adding our names formally. After all, we were paying. I opened the folder. Inside was a revised agreement. Daniel's name was listed. His parents' names were listed. Mine was not. I read it twice before I spoke. "I think there's a mistake," I said calmly. "I'm not included." Margaret gave me that gentle, reassuring smile she reserved for moments she believed I was overthinking. "Oh, darling, it's just cleaner this way. It stays in the family." I blinked. "I am family." "Of course you are," she replied quickly. "But legally speaking, it's simpler if it remains bloodline." Bloodline. The word landed softly, but it cut clean. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "It's just paperwork, Georgie. It doesn't change anything." But it did. because I knew exactly what paperwork meant. I worked in compliance. Documentation defines power. Ownership determines protection. If something happened to Daniel, I would have no legal claim. If decisions were made, I would have no vote. Yet I was the one ensuring the payments never missed a deadline. I could have argued. I could have laid out the financial contributions line by line. Instead, I asked one question. So I'm expected to continue contributing at the current level? Margaret's expression tightened just slightly. Well, yes. We're all benefiting, aren't we? All. I noticed Daniel didn't correct her. The room felt smaller, but I kept my tone level. I'd like to review this properly before signing anything. Margaret laughed softly. There's nothing complicated in it. There was, but not the kind written in clauses. The complication was psychological. In that moment, I understood something for the first time with uncomfortable clarity. They were comfortable accepting my money, but not my position. Useful, but not foundational. Trusted to maintain the house, but not entitled to own it. I didn't cry. I didn't confront. I didn't even refuse. I simply closed the folder and said, I'll look at it this week. And I did, not emotionally, professionally. That night, while Daniel slept, I opened my laptop and began calculating exact contributions from the day we moved in. Every transfer, every standing order, every repair invoice is paid from my account. It wasn't anger driving me, it was alignment. For the first time, I stopped asking whether they respected me. I started asking whether I was protecting myself. That was the first small cut. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise enough to wake me up. And once you wake up to the imbalance, you can't unsee it. After the paperwork incident, nothing exploded. That was the strange part. No one argued. No one followed up aggressively. The folder simply sat on the sideboard for a week, as if waiting for me to quietly sign it and restore everyone's comfort. When I didn't, life continued. Sunday lunches, casual comments, subtle reminders of my role. And slowly, I began noticing how deeply the dynamic had been normalized, not just by them, but by me. Margaret started referring to the house as Daniel's place when speaking to neighbors. Claire once joked, Georgia's basically the live in house manager. We should pay her an exposure. Everyone laughed again. I did too, because correcting every slight feels exhausting when you're the only one who sees it as a slight. Daniel wasn't cruel. That's important. He was simply conditioned. When his mother asked him about renovations, she framed it as, What are you thinking of doing with your house? When bills were mentioned, she would say, I'm glad you're stepping up, darling. Stepping up, as though he were the primary provider, as though I were assisting. I began noticing how often I edited myself to keep things smooth. When Margaret criticized how I organized the pantry, I reorganized it her way. When Claire dropped by unannounced and left a mess, I cleaned it without comment. When Daniel's brother borrowed tools and returned them damaged, I replaced them quietly. Each incident was small. None justified confrontation on their own. But repetition creates a pattern, and pattern creates identity. Over time, I realized I had become the emotional shock absorber of that household. If something needed doing, I did it. If something needed smoothing, I smoothed it. If something needed paying, I paid it. And because I didn't protest, my contribution dissolved into background noise. That's how normalization works, not through force, through habit. There was one evening that crystallized it for me. We were hosting dinner. I had cooked after a full workday. Daniel arrived late. Traffic, he said. His parents were already seated. Margaret tasted the food and smiled politely. It's lovely, dear, though Daniel always preferred a bit more seasoning. Daniel shrugged, amused. Mom knows best. It was light, playful, but something about it lingered. I had just worked 9 hours, stopped at the shops, cooked from scratch, and in a single sentence, my effort became secondary to maternal nostalgia. I washed dishes that night while they talked in the living room, and I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. If I disappeared tomorrow, what would actually change for them? The answer unsettled me. They would notice the inconvenience. They would notice the unpaid bills. They would notice the undone chores. But would they notice me? Or just the absence of what I provided? That realization wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, heavy, clinical. I began replaying conversations in my mind, not emotionally, but analytically. Who deferred to whom? Who decided? Who assumed? And I noticed something else. No one ever asked what I wanted, not maliciously, simply because it didn't occur to them that I might want anything beyond harmony. That was the cost of being agreeable. People assume your comfort is permanent. I started understanding that I had participated in my own minimization. Every time I laughed off a comment, every time I signed a transfer without discussion, every time I chose peace over clarity. Silence can be dignified, but it can also become permission. And I had given far more permission than I realized. What they saw as my personality, calm, compliant, accommodating, was partially true. But beneath it, something was shifting. I wasn't getting louder, I was getting clearer. And clarity doesn't announce itself, it recalibrates. There's a moment in every system where you realize the part you're playing isn't accidental, it's assigned. For me, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Margaret had let herself in again, her key turning in the lock with that familiar, unapologetic click. I was at the dining table, reviewing a compliance report for work, my laptop open, spreadsheets glowing softly in the dim light. She walked straight past me into the kitchen. "I noticed the bins weren't taken out this morning," she called out, already tying the bag. "Daniel's always been forgetful about these things." I closed my laptop slowly. "I usually take them out," I said. "Oh, I know, dear," she replied brightly. "You're so reliable." Reliable. There it was again. Not appreciated. Not respected. Reliable. A function. I watched her move confidently through the house, adjusting the thermostat, straightening a frame on the wall, opening cupboards as if muscle memory gave her authority. And I saw it clearly. In her mind, this was still her son's home. Daniel was the central figure. I was the supporting staff, the efficient, polite, ever capable extension that kept everything running smoothly. Later that night, I asked Daniel something simple. "Do you think your mom sees this as our house?" He looked confused. "Of course she does." "No," I clarified gently. "Does she see it as mine?" He hesitated just long enough for the answer to form on its own. "I don't think she thinks about it like that." Exactly. She didn't think about it like that because the role I had been assigned didn't require ownership. It required maintenance. I began observing more carefully after that. When guests visited, Margaret introduced Daniel as the homeowner. When contractors came by, they directed questions to him, and he answered, even when I had arranged and paid for the service. At family gatherings, Claire would joke, "Georgia's the backbone of the house." It sounded complimentary, but a backbone doesn't get a face. It supports quietly, invisibly. No one debates with the backbone. No one asks the backbone what it wants. It simply holds everything upright. That was the role, not a partner, not an equal stakeholder. Infrastructure, the dependable woman who would ensure comfort, stability, and continuity without claiming center stage. And the unsettling truth, I had reinforced that image. I paid quietly, organized quietly, solved quietly. I thought humility would be interpreted as strength. Instead, it was interpreted as acceptance. One evening, while reviewing the unsigned agreement again, I realized something uncomfortable but freeing. They weren't underestimating me because they disliked me. They were underestimating me because I had made it easy. I never corrected assumptions. I never clarified contributions. I never demanded acknowledgement. I simply ensured everything worked. But a system that benefits from your silence has no incentive to change it. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. There's a difference. Anger reacts, stillness evaluates. And in that stillness, I began asking different questions. Not, why are they treating me this way? But why am I allowing a role that doesn't match reality? Because reality was this: the mortgage payments left my account, the repairs were funded by my salary, the household budget was structured using my spreadsheets. If I withdrew, the entire structure would feel it. And for the first time, I considered what would happen if I stopped performing the role they had assigned me without announcing it, not out of spite, out of alignment. The quiet woman they saw was still there, but she was no longer unaware. And awareness, once activated, rarely goes back to sleep. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen after another comment or another casual dismissal. It happened on a Thursday morning in complete silence. I was sitting in my car outside the bank before work. Rain tapped softly against the windshield, blurring the world into gray streaks. I had just transferred that month's mortgage payment, the full amount, as I had quietly been doing for months now. I stared at the confirmation screen longer than usual. £1,842 and 67 pence automatically deducted from my account. No discussion, no acknowledgement, no legal protection, just an assumption. For the first time, I didn't feel resentment. I felt distance. It was subtle, but unmistakable, like watching my own life from one step outside of it. I imagined explaining the arrangement to a colleague from work, someone neutral. Yes, I pay the entire mortgage. No, my name isn't on the property. Yes, my mother-in-law has a key. Saying it internally, stripped of emotional context, it sounded irrational. Not kind, not patient, irrational. And that realization changed everything. Because I am not irrational. My entire career is built on assessing risk exposure and mitigating vulnerability. I advise executives on compliance failures before they cost millions. I insist on documentation before agreements. Yet in my own life, I had accepted a handshake dynamic built on goodwill, not because I was naive, but because I wanted harmony. Sitting there in the quiet of the car, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. If this situation were happening to someone I advised professionally, what would I tell her? The answer came immediately. Protect yourself, not attack, not accuse. Protect. That was the moment something realigned inside me. I stopped framing the issue as emotional. I stopped asking whether they loved me, respected me, valued me. Those questions were subjective. Instead, I asked, is this structurally sound? And the answer was no. That evening, nothing dramatic happened. Daniel came home tired. Margaret called about a family lunch. Claire sent a message about borrowing the spare room for a weekend. Life continued, but I moved differently inside it. When Daniel mentioned possibly upgrading the kitchen next year, I didn't nod automatically. I said, we'll need to review the ownership structure before any capital investment. He looked surprised. Ownership structure? Yes, I replied calmly. It's important. There was no heat in my voice, just clarity. Later that night, I opened my navy leather planner, the one I use for both work and personal notes. I began listing total contributions to date, legal standing under the current agreement, risk scenarios, contingency options. It didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like alignment with who I already was. For years, I had separated my professional competence from my personal life, as though being analytical at work required me to be accommodating at home. But I realized something simple and profound. Calm does not require self erasure. Kindness does not require self exposure. And silence, when intentional, can be preparation. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else. Margaret still saw me as reliable. Claire still joked. Daniel still assumed. But inside me, a line had been drawn, not out of anger, out of self recognition. I would not escalate. I would not humiliate. I would not create drama. But I would no longer operate in a structure that left me legally and financially invisible. That Thursday morning, in the quiet rain, I stopped being the accommodating daughter in law and became something they had never considered: strategic. After that morning in the car, I didn't change outwardly. That was the part no one noticed. I still cooked. I still hosted. I still responded politely when Margaret let herself in without warning. But internally, my silence had shifted from habit to strategy. There's a difference between staying quiet because you feel small and staying quiet because you're measuring the room. Before, I absorbed comments to preserve peace. Now, I absorbed information to understand leverage. Margaret continued using phrases like Daniel's house and our family property. I didn't correct her. I simply noted it. Claire asked if she could store some boxes in your spare room, quickly correcting herself to Daniel's spare room with a laugh. I smiled, but I stopped smoothing over everything. One Sunday, after lunch, the sink filled with dishes as usual. Everyone drifted toward the living room. I remained seated, not dramatically, not definitely. I simply didn't stand up. There was a pause in the kitchen, subtle, almost imperceptible. Margaret lingered by the counter, waiting for movement that didn't come. Eventually, Daniel returned and began running water. "Oh," Margaret said lightly. "That's usually George's domain." Daniel shrugged. "It's fine, Mum." I watched from the doorway, calm, no confrontation, no speech, just a tiny disruption in expectation. Later that week, I adjusted something else. The automatic mortgage transfer, not stopped, redirected. Instead of sending the full amount from my personal account, I transferred only half the amount Daniel and I had originally agreed to when we first moved in. The remaining funds stayed where they legally belonged, in my account. I didn't announce it. I didn't dramatize it. I simply restored the structure to what had been verbally agreed upon. 2 weeks passed before anyone noticed. Margaret called one evening, voice slightly tighter than usual. "There seems to be a shortfall on the mortgage payment." "Yes," I said evenly. "Daniel and I agreed to split it 50-50. A pause. "Well, that's not how it's been working." "I'm aware," I replied. "But that wasn't the original arrangement." There was no accusation in my tone, just facts. Silence stretched on the other end of the line. Then, "I'll speak to Daniel." And she did. That night, Daniel approached me carefully. "Why didn't you tell me you were changing the payment?" "I didn't change it," I said. "I corrected it." He frowned. "Mum says it puts them in a difficult position." I held his gaze. "It has put me in a vulnerable position for over a year." He didn't have an immediate response. And that was new. For the first time, my silence wasn't cushioning anyone. It was creating accountability. They mistook my calmness for compliance before. Now, they mistook it for stubbornness. But it wasn't either. It was a choice. I was no longer reacting to emotional cues. I was responding to a structural imbalance. Margaret stopped dropping by as frequently after that. Not completely, but noticeably less. Claire's jokes became more cautious. Daniel grew quieter, more thoughtful. The household atmosphere shifted slightly, like air pressure before a storm. But there was no storm, because I wasn't escalating. I wasn't threatening. I wasn't announcing ultimatums. I was simply removing the invisible support beams they had come to rely on without acknowledgement. And here's what fascinated me. The moment I reduced my contribution to its fair share, tension appeared. Not because I had done something wrong, but because equilibrium had been built on my excess. Silence, when chosen, becomes powerful. It forces others to reveal their expectations. It reveals who is comfortable benefiting from the imbalance and who is willing to recalibrate. I wasn't sure yet which category Daniel fell into, but I was about to find out. The interesting thing about being underestimated is this: people stop watching you carefully. They assume predictability, and predictability creates blind spots. After I corrected the mortgage payments, the household atmosphere changed, but not in the way they thought. They believed I was reacting emotionally, that I needed reassurance, that this was a temporary adjustment born from stress. They didn't realize I had already moved beyond emotion. While they were discussing fairness at Sunday lunches, I was studying property law in the evenings, not obsessively. Methodically, I began with the simplest question: what exactly was my legal position? The answer, in its current form, was clear and fragile. No name on deed, no legal claim, no protection if the relationship deteriorated. My financial contributions, while traceable, were technically voluntary under the current agreement. Voluntary. That word lingered. So I began documenting everything with the precision I use at work. Every transfer I had made was beyond the original 50%. Every repair invoice is paid solely by me. Every improvement funded from my account. From the boiler replacement to the roof maintenance. I created a clean spreadsheet. Dates, amounts, descriptions, supporting documents. Not to threaten, to understand. The more I organized the data, the calmer I became. There's something deeply stabilizing about facts. They remove drama. They strip away interpretation. They leave only structure. And structure can be negotiated. I also scheduled a consultation, quietly, with a property solicitor in the city. I didn't tell Daniel, not because I was plotting against him, but because I needed unbiased information before bringing emotion into it. The solicitor was a woman in her early 40s with sharp glasses and a gentler tone than I expected. She reviewed the documentation silently for nearly 10 minutes. "You've been funding this property disproportionately," she said finally. "Yes." "And you're not legally recognized?" "No." She leaned back slightly. "You have options, but timing matters." Timing, that was the word that stayed with me. At home, nothing appeared dramatic. Margaret resumed visits, less frequent, but still assured. Claire continued her light sarcasm. Daniel seemed conflicted, but passive. They thought the situation had plateaued. What they never noticed was that I had stopped improvising my life. I began separating finances formally, opened a dedicated savings account, adjusted my long-term investments, reviewed my pension allocations, not as preparation for divorce, as preparation for autonomy. I also did something quieter, but perhaps more significant. I stopped overfunctioning. If dishes sat longer, they sat. If Daniel forgot to arrange a service appointment, I didn't step in immediately, not as punishment, as recalibration. And what fascinated me was how quickly discomfort surfaced when I withdrew excess effort. Daniel asked one evening almost cautiously, "Are you okay? You seem distant." "I'm focused," I replied. It was true. For years, my focus had been on harmony. Now it was in alignment. There's a difference between love and self-abandonment. I had blurred that line for too long. The more I prepared, the clearer I saw something else. This wasn't just about Margaret or Claire. It was about whether Daniel saw me as a partner or as support staff. And I needed that answer not emotionally, but structurally, because love without structural respect eventually fractures. I wasn't gathering evidence to explode. I was gathering clarity to decide. They never noticed the late evenings at the dining table. My planner open beside the financial statements. They never noticed the solicitor's business card tucked neatly into its inner pocket. They never noticed that I had begun mentally rehearsing two futures, one where this house became legally ours, and one where I walked away from it entirely, without chaos, without spectacle, just precision. Underestimation is a gift if you know how to use it. Because while they were still seeing the quiet daughter in law, I was calculating outcomes, and the numbers were beginning to speak very clearly. The reveal didn't happen in a dramatic office with contracts sliding across a polished table. It happened in my own living room, alone. One evening, after Daniel had gone to bed, I spread everything out across the dining table: bank statements, transfer confirmations, invoices, the unsigned agreement Margaret had drafted, and the notes from my consultation with the solicitor. Rain tapped against the windows again, almost like it had that morning in the car weeks earlier. The house was quiet, still. I opened my spreadsheet and reviewed the final total. Over 18 months, I had contributed nearly £42,000 beyond the original 50% agreement. £42,000. Voluntary, technically, unprotected, legally. I sat back in my chair. There was no surge of anger, no dramatic gasp, just clarity. If I continued at this previous rate, within 3 years, I would have contributed a six-figure sum toward an asset I did not own. That wasn't generosity. That was exposure. I revisited the solicitor's words. You have options, but timing matters. The leverage wasn't emotional. It was financial. The house functioned because I stabilized it. The household ran smoothly because I absorbed friction. The arrangement felt sustainable because I filled its gaps. And here was the part they never considered. If I withdrew fully, not just partially, the structure would strain immediately. Daniel's freelance income could not consistently cover the entire mortgage. His parents had structured their retirement, assuming the payments from us would offset their remaining obligation. In other words, I wasn't an accessory. I was a keystone, and keystones don't announce their importance. They simply hold weight until they move. That night, for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a scenario I had previously dismissed as extreme. What if I stopped paying altogether? Not abruptly, not vindictively, legally, correctly. If Daniel and I separated finances formally, and I declined to fund property I did not own, the responsibility would revert entirely to him and his parents. The strain would be immediate, not catastrophic, but undeniable. I closed my eyes for a moment. This wasn't about punishment. It was about whether I wanted to remain in a system that relied on my quiet overextension. There was something almost liberating about seeing the math clearly. Emotion complicates decisions, numbers simplify them. I realized something else in that stillness. They believe my power, if any, would come through confrontation, through raised voices, through ultimatums. But my power was structural, it was contractual, it was patient, and it was already in motion. I folded the unsigned agreement carefully and placed it back in its folder. Then I wrote one sentence in my Navy planner: leverage exists, decision pending. That was the private reveal, not to them, to myself. For years, I had felt small inside that house. But smallness had never been the truth. It had been a perception. And perception, once corrected, changes everything. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smirk. I simply turned off the light and went upstairs. Because once you recognize your position in a structure, truly recognize it, you don't need theatrics. You need timing. And I was getting very close to choosing mine. The decision didn't arrive in a single cinematic moment. It unfolded over several quiet conversations and one very honest night alone. After the mortgage correction, tension had settled into the house like fine dust, not visible at first glance, but present in the air. Daniel was more careful with his words. Margaret's tone had shifted from breezy certainty to measured politeness. Claire's jokes came less frequently. Something had changed, but nothing had been resolved. One evening, Daniel and I sat across from each other at the dining table. No phones, no television, just the low hum of the refrigerator in the background. "We need to talk about the house," I said. He nodded slowly, already bracing. "I went to get legal advice," I continued. His eyes widened slightly, not in anger, but in surprise. "Without telling me?" "Yes," I said calmly, because I needed objective information before bringing emotion into it. He leaned back, exhaling. And? And structurally, I'm exposed, completely. I laid out the numbers, the overpayments, the lack of ownership protection, the long-term risk. There was no accusation in my voice, just data. Daniel listened quietly. When I finished, he ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't realize it had gone that far," he admitted. "That's the point," I said gently. "No one realized, because I didn't make it visible." Silence stretched between us. "So, what are you saying?" he asked. That was the decision point, because I had options. Option 1: continue as we were, but insist on partial ownership transfer. Option 2: formalize a legal agreement recognizing my financial contributions retroactively. Option 3: withdraw entirely from funding a property I did not own and allow the structure to adjust without me. Each path had consequences. The first required his parents' cooperation. The second required legal complexity and uncomfortable transparency. The third required emotional courage. I had spent weeks thinking through each scenario, not just legally, but relationally. And here is the truth I arrived at. If Daniel needed persuasion to see my equality, ownership paperwork wouldn't fix that. If his parents needed negotiation to recognize my position, any agreement would be fragile. The real question wasn't about property. It was about partnership, so I chose the irreversible option. "I'm stepping back," I said quietly. "Stepping back? How?" "I will no longer fund a property that does not legally recognize me. If we want to stay here, ownership must reflect contribution. If that's not possible, we reassess living arrangements." Daniel's face paled slightly. "You'd really leave?" "I'd leave the structure," I clarified. "Not necessarily you, but I won't remain in imbalance." There was no threat in my tone, just boundary. He stared at the table for a long time. "This will cause issues with mom and dad." "I know. And if they refuse, then we'll know where we stand." That was the irreversible part, not the money, the clarity. Because once you define a boundary calmly and clearly, you can't pretend it doesn't exist anymore. Over the next few days, Daniel spoke to his parents. Margaret's response was predictable. "She's overcomplicating this. Why is she suddenly making it transactional? We're family." Family. The word that had been used to exclude me legally was now being used to guilt me emotionally. But I didn't argue. I simply maintained my position. Ownership reflects contribution. Our contribution adjusts accordingly. There was no middle ground anymore. And here's what I understood deeply in that moment. This decision might cost me comfort. It might cost me reputation within that family. It might even cost my marriage. But it would not cost me self-respect. And that, finally, mattered more than being seen as agreeable. I had chosen. Not loudly, not dramatically, but definitely. The quiet one in the house had stopped negotiating with the imbalance, and the consequences were about to unfold. Once the decision was made, I didn't repeat it. I didn't defend it. I implemented it. That's something I've learned from years in compliance. Once a boundary is documented, you don't re-argue it emotionally. You operationalize it. First, I formally separated our household finances. Daniel and I had always maintained partial independence, but there were shared accounts that blurred contribution. I requested we simplify. "My income will remain in my account," I said calmly. "We can transfer agreed shared expenses monthly." He didn't fight me on it. He looked tired. "I didn't think it would get this complicated," he admitted one night. It was always complicated, I replied gently. It was just invisible. Next, I put something in writing, not aggressive, not threatening, clear. I drafted a proposal outlining two options: formal co ownership transfer, proportional to financial contribution, with legal documentation updated accordingly. Reversion to equal 50-50 mortgage contributions, with no further unilateral financial input from me. No retroactive demands, no legal confrontation, no accusation of unfairness. Just structure. Daniel reviewed it before sharing it with his parents. They're going to take this badly, he said. That's their emotional response, I answered quietly. This is a structural one. Margaret requested a meeting the following Sunday. I agreed. At the dining table, the same one where the unsigned agreement had once sat, she looked at me with controlled disappointment. This feels cold, Georgia. I understand it may feel that way, I said evenly, but it's actually very simple. His father remained mostly silent, scanning the printed proposal. You're talking about percentages and legal transfer as if we're business partners, Margaret continued. In property matters, we are, I replied. The room grew still. No raised voices, no accusations, just discomfort. We never intended to exclude you, she said. I believe that, I answered honestly. But intention doesn't override structure. Daniel didn't interrupt. That was new. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. They pushed back gently at first, then more firmly. Raised concerns about inheritance, about simplicity, about tradition. I didn't argue tradition, I repeated the contribution. Eventually, his father spoke. If we can't restructure ownership immediately, what happens? I continue at 50%, I said calmly. Nothing more. Margaret looked almost wounded. So you're withdrawing? No, I said. I'm aligning. That was the word that seemed to unsettle her most, because alignment implies prior imbalance. The meeting ended without resolution, but something fundamental had changed. I was no longer the silent absorber of gaps. I was the person defining terms. Over the next month, I followed through. No extra payments, no covering unexpected shortfalls. When Daniel's income dipped 1 month, and he hinted that I might temporarily fill the difference, I asked, under which ownership structure? He didn't press further. Tension increased, not explosive tension, structural tension, like a beam under adjusted weight. And here's the critical part. I didn't escalate socially. I still attended lunches. I still spoke kindly. I still cleaned when it was my turn. But I no longer overfunctioned, and without my overfunctioning, cracks became visible. Mortgage reminders became tighter. His parents began recalculating their retirement assumptions. Daniel felt pressure he had never previously experienced. For the first time, the system felt the absence of my excess. And they were only just beginning to understand what that meant. Consequences rarely arrive with noise. They show up in small disruptions first: a missed expectation, a delayed transfer, an uncomfortable pause in conversation. The first visible crack appeared 3 months after I realigned my contributions. Daniel's freelance work slowed unexpectedly. 2 contracts ended within weeks of each other. Nothing dramatic, just the normal instability of self-employment. Before, I would have quietly absorbed the gap. This time, I didn't. The mortgage payment date came and went. Half was covered, my half. The remaining balance triggered an automated notice. Margaret called Daniel immediately. Her voice carried that restrained panic she tried to disguise as concern. There's been a problem with the payment. Daniel explained his income dip. He didn't ask me to intervene directly. But the implication hung in the air when he relayed the conversation later that evening. You know it's temporary, he said carefully. Just until the next contract starts. I understand, I replied. He waited. I held his gaze. And? He asked quietly. And the ownership structure hasn't changed. That was the moment he truly understood I wasn't bluffing. It wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't a phase, it was consistency. His parents covered the shortfall that month, and something shifted immediately. Margaret stopped referring to it as Daniel's house in casual conversation. Now it was the house, subtle but telling. The second crack came with the boiler. It failed unexpectedly in early winter. The repair estimate was significant. Previously, I would have transferred funds within hours. This time, I said, let's review responsibility. Daniel's father hesitated on the phone. Well, historically, Georges handled these things. Historically, I said calmly, I was contributing beyond my share. Silence. The repair was eventually split between Daniel and his parents. No one thanked me for the previous years, but no one asked me to cover it again either. That was progress, though not the kind that feels warm. The atmosphere in the house changed, not hostile, heavier. Daniel carried tension in his shoulders. His parents became more formal around me. Claire visited less often. For the first time, my absence of excess effort was felt, not emotionally, practically. One evening, Margaret said something that revealed everything. I just don't understand why this suddenly matters so much to you. I answered honestly. It always mattered, I just didn't. That stopped her, because she couldn't argue with that. The discomfort in the family wasn't about money. It was about the redistribution of responsibility. When I stopped cushioning consequences, everyone else had to feel them. And that feeling was new. Daniel began asking harder questions. Not of me, but of himself. Why didn't we formalize this earlier? Why did mom assume you'd always cover gaps? These weren't accusations, they were realizations. And realizations are often more destabilizing than conflict. The most telling moment came late one night when Daniel sat beside me on the sofa. I think I've relied on you more than I realized, he said quietly. Yes, I answered, not cruelly, just truthfully. Consequences were unfolding, not in explosions, but in exposure. Exposure of assumptions, exposure of dependency, exposure of imbalance. And here's what surprised me most. The more I held steady, the less I felt resentful. Because resentment thrives in powerlessness, and I was no longer powerless. They were beginning to understand that the quiet one in the house hadn't been passive. She had been carrying more than anyone acknowledged, and now that weight was redistributed, whether they liked it or not. By the time urgency replaced discomfort, the structure had already shifted too far to return to what it was. Daniel's parents requested another meeting. This time, the tone was different, less defensive, more anxious. We sat at the same dining table again, but the energy was tighter. Margaret didn't bring tea. His father had papers in his hands. We've been reviewing everything, he began. And perhaps we should reconsider formal co ownership. Perhaps, months earlier, that word would have relieved me. Now, it felt late. Margaret avoided my eyes at first. We didn't realize how much you'd contributed, she said. Daniel showed us the figures. I nodded. I never hid them. No, she admitted softly. We just didn't ask. That sentence held more honesty than anything said in the previous year. His father cleared his throat. We could explore adding your name to the deed. It may take time, but we can start the process. On the surface, this was what I had asked for. Structural recognition, legal alignment, but something inside me had changed in the months since my decision. It wasn't anger, it was awareness. The offer wasn't coming from a partnership. It was coming from pressure, mortgage strain, repair costs, financial reality. They now understood my leverage because they had felt the absence of it. And that changes the nature of the agreement. I looked at Daniel before responding. He seemed hopeful, relieved, as if this could reset everything. But resets only work when trust hasn't eroded quietly over time. I appreciate that you're reconsidering, I said calmly. Truly. Margaret's shoulders loosened slightly. But ownership isn't just paperwork for me anymore. The room stilled. It's about whether I am recognized before the pressure forces recognition. Margaret swallowed. That wasn't our intention. I know, I replied. But impact matters more than intention. Daniel shifted beside me. So, what are you saying? He asked carefully. I exhaled slowly. I'm saying that even if my name goes on the deed now, the dynamic that allowed me to be financially invisible for over a year doesn't disappear. Silence filled the space. For the first time, no one tried to correct me because they couldn't. Margaret's voice was quieter when she spoke again. What would you have us do? There it was. Not resistance, not dismissal, uncertainty. And I realized something difficult but freeing. Some realizations arrived too late to restore the version of trust that once existed. You can restructure paperwork. You cannot unlearn how someone made you feel when you were unprotected. I need time, I said. Time not to negotiate. Time to decide whether I still wanted to build inside a system that required strain before fairness. That night, Daniel didn't argue. He didn't persuade. He simply asked one question. Are you already halfway out? I thought carefully before answering. I'm halfway awake. And sometimes, awakening changes the landscape so completely that going back to sleep is no longer possible. They were ready to fix it, but the question was no longer whether the structure could change. It was whether I still wanted to stay inside it. The final confrontation didn't feel like a battle. It felt like a closing statement. A week after that meeting, I asked Daniel and his parents to sit down again. Not urgently, not emotionally, simply intentionally. The house was quiet that evening. No teacups clinking, no nervous small talk. I placed a single folder on the table, thinner than before. I've made a decision, I said calmly. Daniel looked at me steadily. His parents waited. I won't be pursuing co-ownership of this property. Margaret blinked. You won't? No, his father frowned slightly. But we agreed to begin the process. I know, I said gently. And I appreciate that. But I've realized something. I paused, choosing precision over performance. I don't want recognition that arrives only when pressure forces it. I want a partnership that exists without strain. No one interrupted. I will continue contributing 50% until we decide on new living arrangements, I continued. But I won't invest further here. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger, in understanding. You're planning to leave, he said quietly. I'm planning to build somewhere structurally equal, I replied. Margaret's voice trembled, just faintly. You're breaking up the family over paperwork. No, I said softly. The paperwork revealed something that was already there. Silence settled over the room. No shouting, no accusations, just gravity. Daniel spoke next. If we move, just the two of us, and start fresh, would that change things? It was the first time he had framed it that way. Without his parents, without an inherited structure. Yes, I answered honestly. It would. Margaret inhaled sharply. You'd leave this house? I never owned this house, I said gently. I only maintained it. That sentence seemed to land deeper than anything else. For a moment, I saw something shift in her expression. Not defensiveness, not pride. Recognition. Late, but real. His father folded his hands slowly. We didn't see it, he admitted. We thought you were content. I was capable, I corrected. Not content. Daniel reached for my hand under the table. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no cinematic apology, just clarity, spoken without heat. By the end of the evening, nothing had been officially decided. Except this. Daniel and I would begin looking for a property of our own. Alone, his parents would retain this house. Their retirement plan would adjust accordingly. There were no hugs, but there were no raised voices either. When they left, the house felt different, lighter. Not because I had won, but because the dynamic had been named, calmly, precisely. And I had chosen not to live inside it anymore. Daniel stood in the hallway afterward, looking around. I didn't realize how much you carried, he said. I didn't either, I replied. And that was the truth. This confrontation wasn't about proving strength, it was about removing invisibility. Without humiliation, without revenge, just alignment. The quiet one had spoken, and she hadn't needed to raise her voice to be heard. We moved 6 months later, not far, just across town. A modest semi detached house with creaky floorboards and a small garden that needs more patience than skill. Both our names are on the deed. Both our salaries contribute to the mortgage. Both our signatures appear on every document. There was no dramatic farewell to the old house. Daniel's parents adjusted. The retirement plan recalibrated. The Sunday lunches continued, slightly more careful, noticeably more respectful. Margaret no longer lets herself in unannounced. She calls. That small change says more than any apology ever could. Daniel and I had difficult conversations during those months. Not explosive ones, honest ones. He admitted he had leaned on the structure he grew up in without questioning it. I admitted I had confused harmony with self erasure. Neither of us was a villain. We were simply operating on inherited assumptions. And assumptions, when unexamined, quietly shape power. In our new home, something subtle shifted in me. I still cook. I still organize. I still prefer calm over chaos. But I no longer overfunction to secure belonging. If dishes sit, they sit. If something needs paying, we discuss it. If a decision affects both of us, it includes both of us. The difference isn't louder boundaries, it's a mutual structure. I also changed something internally. For years, I believed being the quiet one meant I had to absorb more to be valued. That if I wasn't demanding, I had to be indispensable. Now I understand something deeper. Indispensability, without recognition, is just quiet depletion. And depletion eventually turns into resentment unless you interrupt it. I interrupted it, not with fury, not with threats, but with alignment. Margaret once said recently during a visit, I think we underestimated you. She meant it lightly, almost admiringly. I smiled. You didn't, I replied. You just got used to me. There's a difference. Underestimation implies miscalculation of ability. Getting used to someone implies comfort with their overextension. I'm still calm, still observant, still not the loudest person in the room, but I am no longer structurally invisible. At work, nothing changed, except perhaps a deeper steadiness. At home, everything feels more balanced, not because Daniel transformed overnight, but because I stopped cushioning imbalance before it could be felt. And here's the most surprising part. I don't feel bitterness. I don't replay old conversations with anger. Because once I chose alignment, the story stopped being about them. It became about me. About what I accept. About what I protect. About what I build. The quiet one in the house was never weak. She was patient. And patience, when paired with clarity, becomes power. Not loud power, not humiliating power, structural power. And that kind lasts. When people hear this story, they sometimes expect a dramatic ending, a divorce, a shouting match, a triumphant, I told you so. But that's not what happened. No one was destroyed. No one was publicly shamed. No one lost everything overnight. What changed wasn't explosive, it was structural. For a long time, my in laws treated me like the maid in their son's house. Not because they hated me, but because I made it easy for them to rely on me without recalculating my position. And I allowed it. Not because I was weak, but because I equated peace with worth. The real turning point wasn't when I became the only one paying the mortgage. It was when I realized that I had the power to stop and chose to use it calmly. That's the part people underestimate about quiet personalities. We don't always react immediately. We observe, we measure, we think in long timelines, and when we finally move, It's rarely impulsive. It's irreversible. I didn't win by humiliating anyone. I didn't prove my value through confrontation. I simply aligned my contribution with my recognition. And when that alignment didn't exist, I withdrew excess, without rage, without spectacle. That's what quiet dominance really is. Not overpowering others, not raising your voice, but understanding your leverage and refusing to abandon yourself for comfort. If you're the dependable one in your family, if you're the one who keeps everything running, if you're the one who absorbs tension so others don't have to feel it, ask yourself gently, are you appreciated or just relied upon? There's a difference. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been the quiet one who was mistaken for weak until you decided to realign things? Tell me in the comments.